Okay, welcome to week 7. Today we're going to look in 3 lectures on the 3 different chapters that correspond with the assigned topics. And the first one is on the law. We're talking about the law, covenant stipulations for Israel. And so, when we just talk about or think about the subject of the law, one of the things people sometimes say is, well, aren't the laws of the Bible just kind of a bunch of sort of random, ambiguous, arbitrary, kind of annoying things? This is kind of one of the charges people have. Didn't God just make these sort of annoying, arbitrary regulations to limit people's freedom? Isn't that what God was really doing? And the answer to that is no, actually. But the world is full of a lot of really, really, really strange laws. This is a video showing 10 of the world's strangest laws. In Baltimore, Maryland, it's illegal to take a lion to the movies. In Massachusetts, it's illegal to have a gorilla in the back seat of any car. In Texas, it is illegal to shoot a buffalo from the second story of a hotel. In Florida, if you tie an elephant to parking meter, you must pay the same parking fee as if you were for a vehicle. In Oklahoma, it's illegal to take a bite out of another person's hamburger. In Alabama, it's illegal to wear a fake mustache that causes laughter in church. In Kenilworth, Illinois, a rooster must step back 300 feet from any residence if he wishes to crow. In Pennsylvania, it's illegal to sleep on top of a refrigerator outdoors. In South Dakota, it is illegal to lie down and fall asleep in a cheese factory. And in Washington State, it is illegal to harass Bigfoot. All right, those are 10 very, very strange laws. And so I thought it would kind of be funny just to start this whole conversation about the law, covenant stipulations from Israel, by looking at some really strange laws, because we're asking the question right off the bat, what is the law? And the myth is that the law is a group of just arbitrary, annoying regulations designed to limit people's freedom. People look at the Bible and say, there's just a bunch of just strange laws, and all God wants to do is limit people's freedom. And that's a myth, actually. We're going to learn today what the law actually is. All right, so one of the things we say about the law is that the law is actually a part of the story of Israel. When God gives the law to his people, he does it as a part of a book of the Bible called the Exodus. There's Genesis and then there's Exodus, and it's the story of Israel who leaves Egypt, having been slaves in this pagan land of Egypt for 400 years, and about how God is rescuing and saving and delivering his people in the Exodus. And so the law is encased, enshrined, interconnected with this great story of redemption and salvation on the part of God for his people. But the challenge for God is to get his people out of Egypt, but then transform those people. Many of them who've lived in this pagan land for a long time, many of the ones who are leaving are not any different than the pagans themselves. And so the challenge is not getting the Israelites out of Egypt, but getting the Egypt out of the Israelites. Part of the reason God gives the law is that it is a gift to God's people to assimilate them, not just ethnically, but religiously, to become a community that lives in proper relationship to God and each other. Now, when we think about the word law in the Bible, there are at least 5 meanings. Anytime you see the word the law, it could be in reference to the 600 plus laws of the Bible. In other words, a plural reference to the laws of the Bible. It could be a reference singularly to all those laws collected together. It could be a reference to the books of the law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, also known as the Pentateuch. It could be a reference to the Old Testament religious system. Many times Paul and in the New Testament, in the Gospels, the law refers to the religious system itself. And then also, the Pharisees and others will refer to the law in reference to their own rabbinic traditions, their own interpretations and oral traditions associated with the law. So the word, the law, or the phrase the law, has various meanings in the Bible. When it comes to the law itself, there's also different types of law. There is, first of all, what we might call civic law in the Bible, criminal law, the laws of living in the land of Israel, and those laws are respective to that particular culture and that particular time. Just like living in the United States, we have different laws than if we were living in Canada, and the laws of Canada don't apply to us. Those civic and criminal laws of Israel were specific to those people living in that time. There are also, of course, ritual laws. We see that in the books of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, all these laws about the priests and the temple and the sacrifices and all of those things, which also are not really binding on us anymore because there is no temple, there is no priesthood. But then there's another type of law in the Bible, and that's called the ethical law. And this is the one that we see in the New Testament is sometimes binding on us. And we'll learn today how we decide which of the ethical laws is still we're still obligated to follow as New Testament Christians. The other thing to realize is that the law in the Old Testament comes at us in two different forms. Laws that are apodictic and laws that are casuistic. Apodictic laws are the laws of do's and don'ts. Thou shalt not is an apodictic law. And typically when the text gives us a thou shalt not steal or kill or whatever that particular law is, we're to see that law as exemplary. In other words, the law doesn't say thou shalt not steal just certain things, but we're not supposed to steal anything. We're not supposed to take anything that isn't ours from somebody else. And so these laws function as exemplary, not exhaustive. Now, there are cases where a judge is required to step in and to interpret whether or not an apodictic law really applies in certain situations. So, for example, in Leviticus, it says that when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time and pick up the grapes that have fallen. Why? Because it says, leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. So the concern is, when you go through your crops and you bring in your crops, leave some for the people who are needy and hungry and poor and foreigners. I'm the Lord your God. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not deceive one another. Do not swear falsely. Do not defraud or rob. Do not hold back the wages of a hired worker. Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind. But fear your God. I am the Lord. These are apodictic laws, and they describe exemplary situations. And so that's kind of how they work. The other kind of law is casuistic law. Another way to say that is case law, case-by-case situations. This kind of law is conditional. It'll say something like, if this happens, you're in this particular situation, this is the way you're supposed to handle that. So it's conditional. It applies in only certain situations and only to certain people. And what's interesting is that the Old Testament has over 600 casuistic laws, of which 0 are renewed for us in the New Testament. So then the question might be, if 0 of them are renewed in the New Testament, what function, if any, do any of these casuistic laws have for us today? So let's take a look at one of them. In Deuteronomy 15:12-17 it says, if any of your people, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you 6 years, In the seventh year, you must let them go free. I don't know if you know this or not, but in the Bible, God allowed servitude, or what we'd call slavery, to happen among his people. But he was very specific in saying not permanent slavery. Just think about it. Israel had left Egypt and they had been slaves their entire lives for generation after generation. So one of the things that God put into the law was servitude can happen, but it can't happen forever. It can only happen for a limited amount of time. In the seventh year, you must let them go free. When you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. That is why I give you this command today. If your servant says to you, I do not want to leave you because he loves you and your family is well off, then take an awl and push it through his earlobe into the door, and he will become your servant for life. Do the same for your female servant. So this kind of example here, this example of casuistic law, if you have the role of taking care of a servant, having a slave, this is what you must do. Now, what could we possibly learn from something like that? Well, actually, there is hermeneutical value here. Not so much in what we're supposed to do, maybe as in what we learn about God. Think about what we learn about God from this story. That God, when he saved the Israelites, also gave them laws to teach them how to treat other people who are slaves. What does it show us about our God? That his provision for us, his love for all of his people, for all humanity. The character of God, who's compassionate and loving. It may not show us a lot about practice, but it shows us a whole lot about theology and about who God is. And what's interesting is when you compare the laws that we find in the Old Testament with the other laws that we know existed in the ancient Near East, one thing becomes very clear. The law we read about in the Bible shows us a very different view of God. Here are two examples of ancient Near Eastern or A&E law codes. The Akkadian Law Code of 1800 BC, which predates the Mosaic Law by about 400 years. The Code of Hammurabi, which also is pretty old, 1726. In these laws, and I'll show you these real quickly, both of them treat women and servants as property. They denigrate the value, the relationship of men and women. Women are placed beneath men, servants are placed beneath. That takes place in the ancient Near Eastern laws. So that the laws of the Akkadians, which are the neighbors of the Israelites, says that if a free man has no claim against another free man, but seizes the other free man's servant girl, detains the one seized in his house, and causes her death, he must give 2 servant girls to the owner of the servant girl as compensation. There's no punishment. I mean, he kills somebody, but there's no punishment other than he has to compensate by providing slaves as a payment. If he has no claim against him but seizes the wife or child of an upper class person and causes their death, then it's a capital crime. So a capital crime is only against people of the high classes. If it's people of the low classes, not that big of a deal. The one who, in that situation, who did the seizing would die if it was against the high class person. Now, the laws of the codes of the Hammurabi, the Babylonian king, says something like this. If a free nobleman hits another free nobleman's daughter and causes her to miscarriage, the child dies, he must pay 10 shekels of silver for her fetus. If that woman died, they must put his daughter to death. In other words, if he hits a woman, loses the child, but then the mom also dies, he doesn't pay a punishment for it. His own personal daughter must pay the punishment, and it's capital punishment. She must die. If by a violent blow he causes a commoner's daughter to miscarriage, pay 5 shekels of silver. If the woman dies, pay half a mina of silver. If he hits a free nobleman's female servant and causes her to miscarriage, pay 2 shekels of silver. She's just a servant. The female servant dies, just pay a little bit of silver. So you see the contrast. The higher classes, the punishments are capital, but for the lower classes, the servants, the slaves, not that big a deal. And the contrast here is huge. In the Old Testament law, there is a quantum leap in the way it views the value of human life. The command, "You shall not murder," it applies to men and to women equally. The laws of Deuteronomy provide protection for servants. Under Old Testament law, servants who were fleeing for their life had to be protected. And Deuteronomy forbids children paying the punishment for their parents' crimes. So the way that the Old Testament laws depict things and describe things are a total quantum leap in the way they value human life. Things are much more equal between the classes and between all the people. What was Israel's Old Testament law problem? Many people believe that the reason we have a New Testament is because the people in the Old Testament didn't follow the law because they couldn't follow the law. This idea has been raised and propounded for many, many years, but it's actually a myth. Israel's problem was not an inability to keep the law. Israel's problem in the Bible was always an unwillingness to keep the law. When we read the story of the Bible, like say the book of Judges, the problem for Israel was not that they couldn't keep the law, it's that they just didn't want to. They turned their backs on God and they went and did their own thing. So this is sort of clarifying for us then what is the law, what was the law, the kinds of laws, how the law of the Old Testament is really different. So here comes another question. Should Christians follow the Old Testament law? Is the Old Testament law binding on New Testament Christians? Well, the first thing we need to notice here is that the Old Testament law is by definition covenantal. That is to say that the Old Testament law exists within the language of a covenant, an agreement between God and the people of Israel. Now you may say, what is a covenant? Now a lot of us kind of know what a covenant is because we've heard people, well, Abraham had a covenant, Moses had a covenant, David had a covenant. But actually the Mosaic law that we read about in the Old Testament was a formal covenant. It was an ancient example of the way covenants were created in the ancient culture. In other words, this wasn't just an agreement. This was a formal legal agreement between God and his people. Formal covenants existed as a suzerain, a king, some kind of lord or overlord, would conquer a vassal kingdom. Say the Babylonians would conquer some nation. The weaker servant kingdom would enter into an agreement with this powerful king, and the king would set the terms of the agreement, and the people had to follow what the king said. The covenant that God makes with Israel in the Old Testament follows this pattern exactly. There were 6 parts to covenants in the ancient Near Eastern world. We know this by studying them, and here they are. The 6-part covenant form of the ancient Near East was preamble, prologue, stipulations, witnesses, sanctions, and document. So that the preamble would start with the description of the parties involved. In other words, it would start out by, the covenant document would start out by saying, okay, now this is an agreement between God and Israel, the parties involved. Then it would give a prologue about how the parties became connected with each other, how that they came to know each other. And it would tell the story in the Bible of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the experience of Israel in Egypt, and God calling Moses, and so on. The stipulations would then follow, and these would be all the laws and the requirements that one would have to follow in order to keep this covenant. Then the witnesses would be named, and in the Old Testament, the witness is the one who enforces the law, and in the case of the Old Testament law, that is God. Then sanctions would be given. These are the blessings if you follow the law. These are the curses that would follow if you violated the law. And then the document, which was a provision for review. It would say, this is what you need to do to remind the people of the law. So this is the way the covenant form worked. For the Old Testament law to be covenant meant this. It meant that God had made an agreement between himself and Israel in the law that established the terms of a relationship, the means of loyalty, and the blessings and curses of disobedience. So this is what God chooses to do. He chooses to use this ancient form, known as covenant, to enact an agreement between himself and his people and what would happen if they violated that covenant. Why does it matter? Here's the deal. You can't understand the Old Testament story unless you understand this Old Testament covenant law. Unless you really get inside of understanding what this concept really meant, that God had entered into a covenant agreement with his people, you don't understand Genesis through Deuteronomy, and you don't understand the rest of the Old Testament either. You cannot understand the prophets without understanding this Old Testament covenant. Because what the prophets do is they keep pointing back to this covenant and the stipulations and the laws and why the people need to get right with God in terms of these stipulations and laws. What the prophets do is they remind people of the covenant with God that they had made. Number two, the Old Testament is not our testament. As we think about the question, should Christians follow the Old Testament, keep the Old Testament, abide by the Old Testament, we need to remember that the Old Testament is not our testament. We are not under the Old Covenant. We're under a new covenant in relationship with God under new terms. The Old Testament law can't be practiced today because there's no temple system, no sacrifices, no high priests. And what's more is that Jesus teaches us in Matthew 5:18 that the Old Testament law has been fulfilled. It's not changeable, but it doesn't need to be changeable because it has met its fulfillment in Jesus. In other words, it no longer applies. It has stopped applying to us because God has created and formulated a new agreement with new terms for us to demonstrate our loyalty to God in terms of and under these new terms. The other thing we have to remember, and I said something about this a minute ago, is that there are three different kinds of laws in the Bible: civil laws, ritual laws, ethical laws. And the Old Testament civil and ritual laws don't apply to us. The civil or criminal law of the Old Testament specifically addressed the nation of Israel. It doesn't apply to us any more than the laws of Canada apply to the people who live in the United States. They're different countries with different borders and different legal systems. The ritual laws of the priests and sacrifices have been replaced, not only because the temple has been destroyed, but because the book of Hebrews says that Christ is our Passover lamb, that he's fulfilled all the sacrificial system in himself. It's complete. There's no longer a need for the religious system of Israel. The New Testament affirms some Old Testament ethical laws. Some of the Old Testament ethical laws, not civil or criminal laws, not the religious laws, but the ethical laws, some of them do apply to us. And in fact, what Jesus does in the New Testament is he simplifies them all the way down to two commandments: love God, love each other. The love of God and the love for each other summarizes the entire law. It's the law of love. It's the law of Christ. It's the golden rule. It's all these things wrapped up in a single, simple package. And so, in order to understand what the law of the kingdom of God looks like, is that it is the law of love. This is what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount. That's why he described all these situations in which the law said something and you'd heard people say, but he said, wait a minute. What God really intended was for you to love him and to love your neighbor as yourself. The Old Testament law is the word of God, but it is not the command of God to us. It was the command of God to them, but it is not God's command to us. When God said in Deuteronomy 22:8, build parapets around your roof so your neighbor doesn't fall off and die. That's a wonderful teaching for them. But it's not a command to us. It shows us the character of God, the love of God, the provision of God for the people who live around us. But it is not a command to us that every time we build a house, we need to put parapets around our roof. For an Old Testament law to apply to us, it must be exactly and explicitly renewed in the New Testament. And the only real example of that is the law of love, the law of loving God and loving each other, or as Paul calls it, the law of Christ. So here is the hermeneutical rule to write down, star, remember, it's on the test. Here it is. Assume, when it comes to the Old Testament law, assume nothing applies to you. Assume nothing applies to you, and apply only what is explicitly said in the New Testament. So as we read the Old Testament law, we read it not to get the explicit teaching of God for us today. So then somebody says, well, why should I read it? What good is it for me today? What value is it for me today? Well, here's a few things. First of all, it's necessary to know it in order to understand the story of Israel, the story of God and his people, salvation history, salvation story. It also teaches us very much about the character of God, a God of justice who values human life, but also a God of grace and mercy who saves and rescues his people even when they sin. It has other benefits. And as we read the Old Testament laws, sometimes we go, oh, these are just weird, strange, ambiguous, arbitrary laws in which God is just trying to limit the freedom of his people. No. Some of these laws probably had very real benefits. The food laws, which restricted the eating of seafood, may have had the added benefit of protecting the Israelites from many allergies and diseases that are common among shellfish. In fact, still today, one of the most common allergens is seafood. The restriction regarding shedding blood and the teaching of using blood as a part of the sacrificial system reminded people in Israel that sin always brings death and ultimately would foreshadow the cross. Prohibitions, strange ones like not cooking an animal in its mother's milk, seem strange to us today. Like, why would you ban that? But very likely they were beneficial because in their own culture, these were strange, cultic, pagan, superstitious practices in which people thought if they did that, it would bring fertility blessings, that their crops would increase, and so on. And these strange customs and cultures contradicted the real character of God, which was his love and provision for his people Israel. And another benefit that the Old Testament laws had on the people then is that the laws offered blessings. For example, Israelites were commanded not to just have one tithe, but 3 tithes, and the 3rd tithe was to be given as provision for widows, orphans, and foreigners. And so if you lived in the land of Israel, if you were a poor widow who just lost your husband, had no way to care for your family, 25 years old, 6 kids or whatever, how are you going to get along? Thankfully, God, in his loving provision for his people Israel, created an institution that made sure that the widow and her family were cared for by this 3rd tithe. The children living in that land would be supported, the orphans would be cared for and taken care of. What if, Lord forbid, that she's not just a widow, but both parents are killed, and the poor children are left desolate. Who's going to care for them and take care of them? Well, thankfully the 3rd tithe did that. Or let's say you're a foreigner passing through the land, a refugee from a foreign country where you were hunted and hurt, and you come as an immigrant into this land of Israel. Is anybody going to take care of you? Thankfully, there is a 3rd tithe. So one of the things that is incredible about this Old Testament law is that it offers benefits, natural, real benefits to the people living underneath the covenant of God. All right, so that's how we go about interpreting the Old Testament law. None of it applies to us unless it is explicitly indicated in the text. And there are real benefits to it for them then. And for us today, it shows us about God's provision, God's love, and His care for His people. All right, welcome to Lecture 7.2. We're looking at the prophets now, enforcing the covenant in Israel. As we talk about the prophets today, I want us to begin by asking the question, what are the prophets? And to introduce the prophets to us, we have this funny, silly little video from the Veggie Tales.
Sunday school lady, what is a prophet?
I got this one. Being a pirate can be very profitable. That's the wrong kind of profit. You're talking about profit, spelled P-R-O-F-I-T. That's the money you make in a business. If it costs you $2 to make a snow cone, and you can sell that snow cone for $3, the extra dollar is your profit. Right. Isn't that what we're talking about? No. We're talking about profit. P-R-O-P-H-E-T. Pastor Paul, what is a prophet?
Several Hebrew words are translated as prophet in English. The most common means one who is called. Most importantly, a prophet is someone who speaks for someone else. In the Old Testament, that someone else is usually God.
All right, that's a great little introduction. Isn't it a fun introduction? What is a prophet? A prophet is someone who speaks for God, a Navi, one who is called of God. Well, let's take a look at prophets in the Bible. There are two classifications of prophets, and of all the prophets in the Bible, you can put all of them into these two categories. There are prophets who wrote and prophets who did not write. The prophets who wrote we call writing prophets, and the prophets who did not write we call the classical prophets. We know that there were hundreds of prophets who did not write anything down. And we know that there were 16 prophets who did write things down. One of the most famous prophets who did not write anything down is the prophet depicted here in this picture, which is Elijah and his follower Elisha. There were other prophets, the prophets during the reigns of David and other figures in the Bible, didn't write anything down, although we know about them from the biblical narrative and the biblical story. We don't know about what they prophesied, but we do often know a little bit about their lives and what they did. What's interesting about the written prophets is we know what they said, but we know very little about what they did and who they were. And so that's kind of an interesting problem. Another way to classify the prophets is into two categories. There were major prophets and there were minor prophets. And this is a total misnomer. When you hear the word major and minor, people think important and unimportant. But the words major and minor were actually added many, many centuries later when the Bible was translated into the Latin language of the Roman Empire. These books became known as major and minor at that time. And it refers not to their significance or importance or message, but actually to the length of the documents. So that Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel are the longer books, and so we might call them the longer prophets rather than the major ones. And the shorter works came to be known as the minor prophets. And they were grouped together even in the time of Jesus already as a book of the 12 minor prophets. Now, all the prophets, all the major, all the minor prophets, and you can see there's 16 of them here, they all prophesied during a period of time. And so the background, the historical background of the prophets is from the time of Amos in 760 BC to the time of Malachi in 460 BC. So there's a period of time there of about, 300 years? And that's a pretty long period of time, and so it becomes really, really important that a person who wants to understand the prophets knows exactly the historical background in which they are writing to understand their message. All right, let's talk about the nature of prophecy itself. When you hear the word prophecy today, the typical meaning of the word prophet or prophecy is somebody who predicts the future or who foretells the future. But in the Bible, the prophet's primary job had nothing to do with the future. The prophet's primary job was simply to speak for God. In Hebrew, the Navi, the one who's called by God, who speaks as God's representative. And so most of the prophet's message in the 16 different prophets is very little of it is foretelling. It is almost all forthtelling. It is almost all preaching or speaking on behalf of God to the people. And when it does speak of the future, it almost always refers to the near future, not the distant future. In other words, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel is not talking about our time. It's referring to its own time period. Scholars suggest that maybe only 2% of all the prophetic material even refers to Israel's coming of a Messiah, for example. So very, very, very little of it is futuristic in that sense. So we need to know that when we're reading the prophets. We also need to know the function of prophecy. What was the role of a prophet, and what were they doing by doing all this prophesying? What was this prophesying for? Well, it was primarily for covenant enforcement. You'll recall last time we talked about the law and how the Mosaic law was created within this covenant framework in which God made stipulations and requirements upon his people to follow these laws, and if they didn't, there'd be consequences, blessings or cursings. All right? And then also that there was a way in which the covenant would be reviewed. The document would be reviewed. Well, it is the job of prophets to come to the people and say, listen, I've been sent on behalf of God to tell you and remind you of his covenant. These are the rules, these are the restrictions, these are the blessings, these are the cursings. This is what's going to happen if you don't follow. There's going to be hell to pay for what you've done. So their job is primarily as legal covenant enforcers of the law of God. And they're delivering this message on behalf of God, not anyone else, and certainly not themselves. They are the Navi, the ones who are called by God. In their respective office in the land of Israel,